In the 1980s, the Western genre seemed completely dead. Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate had put the final nail in the coffin for United Artists, the Hollywood Renaissance, and the Western. American audiences turned away from what had become bloated, introspective, and self-aggrandizing films that seemed so intent on creating a political commentary that they forgot what the genre was built on: entertaining characters and enjoyable action. And so, throughout the 1980s, the Western was replaced by the new age of blockbuster cinema that actually delivered entertainment while also delivering subtle political commentary. Movies like Platoon and Blade Runner, directed by the artists savvy enough to emerge from the wake of the new Hollywood unscathed, became the new standard, leaving the Western in the dusty plains of the past. When the 1990s came around, it seemed like nobody even cared. But then, out of nowhere, Western veteran Clint Eastwood delivered exactly what the genre needed. Some postmodern nihilism and extreme violence, perfect for the film environment of the 1990s. Unforgiven, a treatise on the falsities of macho posturing and a deconstruction of several mythical elements of the Western that were left untouched by Altman and Peckinpah, swept the nation and was responsible for revitalizing the Western at a point where it seemed such an act was impossible. The movie won 4 Oscars, and the Western had clearly gotten back in the saddle. Its sister film, Dances with Wolves, also carried much of the responsibility for reviving the genre. It swept the Academy Awards too, winning 7 in 1990 because of its unique take on the role of the American Indian and the frontier itself in the Wild West. As the new millennium began, it seemed like the revisionist Western had returned in full force. But then, something happened that changed America and its view of itself forever.
Amanda Lang at the New York Stock Exchange, where we could be in for a solid open to the trading day. Stock index futures point to some buying for the broader market and for techs. One sector that could provide a boost, wireless stocks. Nokia is saying it expects to meet earnings targets for the current quarter, but the world's largest mobile phone maker is warning that third quarter sales will be about 5% below the year-ago level.
This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. The CNN Center right now is just beginning to work on this story, obviously calling our sources and trying to figure out exactly what happened, but clearly something relatively devastating happening this morning there.
Now, can you see if there's a lot of debris downstairs, Winston?
No, because it looked like it inverted. With the impact, everything went inside the building.
Inside.
The only thing that came out was a little bit of the outside awning. But I'd say the hole is, let me just get a better look right now.
Okay, go ahead.
I'd say the hole takes about, looks like 6, 7 floors were taken out. And there's more explosions right now. Hold on, people are running.
Wait, hold on just a moment. We've got an explosion inside.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! What? Oh my God! It's serious! Guys, what do we do?
After September 11th, 2001, America was a different place. Never before had the continental US seen an attack of such devastation and magnitude. Suddenly, America felt itself shifting in a dangerous direction. The country was pulled into a war that was protested even more than Vietnam, and it seemed like all media had to somehow reconcile itself with this new confrontation of devastation and disarray. This heavy modernization seemed to destroy the appeal of the Western altogether. Why would anyone want to watch a movie about macho men and guns, even if it was critical of the archetypal view of the American identity that now seemed more dangerous than ever? And, in the face of this new, terrifying, and broken America, it seemed like one person was more capable of articulating the fall of the United States than any other. This man was Cormac McCarthy. McCarthy had been a working writer since the 1960s, but after 9/11, his dark and nihilistic viewpoint found more relevance. and it was his novel No Country for Old Men that would shape the Western into a new and vibrant form. The film adaptation, brought about by the Coen brothers in 2007, was barely recognizable as a Western from the outset. Set in modern day and rejecting seemingly every trope that had ever been recognized in the genre, No Country for Old Men ushered in the era of neo-Westerns. These films were dark, contemplative, extremely violent, existential, and intensely critical of not just the cowboy hero or the Western myth, but of America as a whole. The Coen brothers had ushered in a new era for the Western genre. No Country for Old Men opens with beautiful vistas of the Wild West, reminiscent of the classical Westerns. Over this opening sequence, Tommy Lee Jones delivers a monologue that sounds very close to John Wayne in his last days, an aged and mournful voice delivering a requiem for the simpler times of the Old West. "Crime has changed," he says. "Things have gotten very extreme and hard to cope with." This new West takes the shape of the film's villain, established in the opening sequence before we meet our hero. Anton Chigurh, a tall, imposing figure dressed in all black, seems at first to be reminiscent of the classical Western's black hat-wearing bandits. From the outset, Chigurh seems to be little more than a cowboy Michael Myers, devoid of identity and the embodiment of all evil. But the Coens soon erase this possibility. In a scene where Chigurh stops at a gas station and demands a coin toss, the audience begins to realize that there is more to Chigurh than meets the eye. He has a set of standards, a warped moral code that influences his killing. He is more than a psychopathic killer. He is a man with a job and a strangely chivalrous method of action. It is then that we meet our hero, Llewellyn Moss, played by Josh Brolin. The directors give the audience no information about him at all, other than he is out hunting in the desert. In a way, he bears the same blank slate that Chigurh does. And, in the beginning of the film, he too falls prey to sin. Llewellyn encounters a crime scene, the site of a literal Mexican standoff, where drug dealers fought it out over a hoard of cash. Everyone is dead, except for one man, who begs Llewellyn for water. But Llewellyn isn't interested in giving the man sympathy. Instead, he wants to make off with the abandoned cash. Propelled by greed and perhaps the hope for a better future for himself and his wife, he steals the cash and begins the series of events that are detailed in the film. The movie is slowly paced, with long stretches of silence juxtaposed against short bursts of extreme violence. There is some reminiscence of Peckinpah in the Coen style here, with gunfights and action scenes being portrayed as realistically and disgustingly as possible, almost as a cautionary tale against violence itself. For the Coens, nothing is sacred. They butcher a seemingly important character, played by Woody Harrelson, without any qualms. And then, in an almost Hitchcockian twist, they butcher the hero 2/3 of the way into the film. And what's more impressive is that they do it off-screen, erasing him without compassion or remorse, almost as if it was a foregone conclusion. It is at this point that the themes of the film burst wholly out of the work itself. The Coen brothers don't just want to make a critical view of the Western genre, but they want to kill every part of it. The villain and the hero are different sides of the same coin, both violent and driven by moral standards that the audience can never truly get a grasp on. The world is dark and nihilistic, and the individual characters don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Life is chance, and even a person like Chigurh, who seemingly understands this unpredictability, can still fall victim to it, being injured in a car crash after forcing Llewellyn's wife to bet her life on a coin toss. Not only is the Western myth dead, but now it seems like everyone knows it. America itself is falling apart, no longer able to aspire to the idealistic views of the previous millennium. Good and bad aren't just shades of gray, but they're shades that are virtually indistinguishable. Violence is everywhere, and it seems like there's nothing we can do to stop it. And then, the film closes on a melancholy monologue, with Tommy Lee Jones describing his dreams about his father. He says that he dreamed that his father was waiting for him in a snowy mountain pass, lighting a fire for when he arrives. The Coens leave this dream up to the audience's interpretation, questioning whether it is the musings of an old and obsolete man struggling to find meaning in a world where God is dead, or something more poignant, speaking about coming to terms with this loss of meaning and a longing for the past. With No Country for Old Men, the Coen brothers reshaped everything that had ever been known about the Western. Just as America's self-image had been destroyed by 9/11, so too had the Western been destroyed by No Country. And then, just months later, a different take on the Western arrived. Paul Thomas Anderson, like the Coens, was a well-known director before his first Western. His breakout film, Boogie Nights, was a send-up of the 1970s and 80s, a teardown of American idealism and consumerism. So, by 2007, it seemed natural that he would be the one to deliver a film about greed and a loss of morality in the modern age. There Will Be Blood was less of a neo-western than No Country. It was set at the turn of the 20th century, and was firmly situated in the context of the Wild West that had been told before. However, other than its setting, There Will Be Blood shares very little with the westerns that had come before it. The film is a chronicle of a self-made oil baron, not a lawman or a cowboy hero. The villain is not a bandit or a malicious company, but a small-town preacher. And, much like the western of the Coen brothers, traditional morality was thrown out the window. Daniel Plainview, played by Daniel Day-Lewis, is the film's main character. He starts the film at the bottom of a hole, looking for gold. And, upon finding this gold, he sets about building an empire. If the Coen brothers are paying homage to Peckinpah with their uber-violent and broken western, then P.T. Anderson is giving a tribute to his mentor Robert Altman with There Will Be Blood. The film tells a story not unlike Altman's McCabe and Mrs. Miller, but with much more cynicism and darkness wrapped in. Both movies tell the story of a self-made man who comes to a small town to make a living with no qualms about exploiting the inhabitants. But McCabe is a man with some kind of naive morality, and when the big company comes to buy out his land, he realizes that there isn't any room for small business in capitalist America. Daniel Plainview, on the other hand, has no real morality outside of his own personal gain. He murders the people that wrong him and discards human life like building supplies. And, ultimately, because of this, he becomes successful. While McCabe undergoes a change when he meets Mrs. Miller and decides that maybe there is something more important than money, Plainview does just the opposite. Not only does he spend his entire life isolated and distrustful, but he actually fabricates connections to benefit himself. He adopts a son only to use him as a business ploy and promptly abandons him as soon as he becomes a burden. But really, There Will Be Blood is a statement on modern morality in general. In a modern era where God and conventional morality is dead, what defines good and bad is up in the air. Daniel Plainview, despite all of his faults, is the film's protagonist, and the preacher, Eli, is a villain. What sets the two apart, though, is that Plainview manipulates people for personal gain and acknowledges the fact that he is a manipulator. Eli, however, manipulates people and their faith without even the slightest self-awareness. Eli is a despot and a liar, just like Plainview, but he does so to make himself feel significant or holy instead of for something tangible. The most powerful message in the film, though, is one that was unintended upon its creation. The movie ends with Eli coming to Plainview to beg for money as he has lost everything in the stock market crash. What results is not only one of the best acted scenes of all time, as Plainview forces Eli to come to terms with being a charlatan, but also an indirect statement on the recession that hit America just months before the film's release. In what seemed like an instant in 2007, hundreds of thousands of people fell on hard times without really knowing why. And, when they begged for help, the system ignored them, just as Plainview does to Eli. Plainview's monologue about a milkshake resonated with an America that had just witnessed many giant corporations steal their well-being out from under them without their permission, and get away with it. There Will Be Blood joined No Country for Old Men as one of the greatest masterpieces of cinema in the 21st century. And, finally, it seemed like the Western was back for good. And then, a few years later, the Coens returned with another Western film. But instead of delivering a deconstruction of the genre, this time they paid homage to one of its classics. True Grit is a reworking of the novel and film of the same name, an incorporation of elements from both original texts to create a new work entirely. True Grit tells the story of a young girl, Maddie Ross, as she sets out to find revenge for her father's murder. And this revenge takes the shape of Rooster Cogburn, a degenerate U.S. Marshal, originally portrayed by John Wayne, and now reinterpreted by Jeff Bridges. Rooster is more than the macho cowboy hero that Wayne made him out to be in 1969. In the Coens film, he's disgusting and an alcoholic, driven by little more than a need for money to buy liquor and some strange inkling of masculinity. The duo are joined by a foppish Texas Ranger named LaBeef, portrayed by Matt Damon. In the original 1969 version, LaBeef was comedic, but ultimately a hero alongside Rooster. In the Coens film, he is a buffoon and a creep, little more than a tiny man with big shiny spurs and a frilly jacket. But what really stands out in the film is Maddie Ross, played by Haley Steinfeld. In the original, she was a strong-headed young woman, but she's ultimately a barely effective child that serves little more than an added challenge for John Wayne to bear. In the Coens version, she is younger than the original, but more headstrong and intelligent than her predecessor. And, instead of being a useless burden, Maddie is the one that is responsible for keeping the men in line. She may be innocent and idealistic, but it is that very idealism that overcomes the curmudgeon-y and alcohol-obsessed Rooster and the egotistic LaBeef to work together in the name of a justice that seems long forgotten. The ending of the 1969 version made out LaBeef to be a hero, sacrificing his life to save Maddie, and the ultimate conclusion that Maddie and Rooster have become a sort of family. The Coens rule this happiness out, letting LaBeef survive but remain a cocky idiot and making the characters separate from each other. Rooster dies without seeing Maddie again after retiring to become a caricature of a cowboy at a Wild West show. And, in a brilliant visual metaphor, Maddie Ross is left physically crippled by her adventure, just as the myth of the West had become. Although True Grit is a reworking of two original texts, it actually bears more thematic similarities to another classical Western, The Searchers. Both True Grit and The Searchers tell the story of an idealistic young person setting out with a broken-down icon of the old ways in order to find justice and return broken. And, much like The Searchers, the Coens film seems like a requiem for an old fable, a eulogy for an American identity that was lost to the sands of time. After True Grit, the Western lives on. Tarantino has delivered two others, and even the Coens have come back to make another entry into the genre. But somehow, the Western seems empty in the modern era of the internet. The cowboy hero has lost all real meaning, now nothing more than an obsolete icon and a symbol of the bigotry and crimes of a bygone era. But maybe that's what they always were. The Great Train Robbery was never a celebration of the West, but a reflection of the violence that built this country. Stagecoach was an inspection of class structures and a redefining of the American character that favored those looked down upon by mainstream society. The Searchers and the Wild Bunch tell the story of outdated and racist outlaws tossed away and eaten up by a modernizing society, no longer needed and representing a bigotry that was best left in the past. The classic Western is more than just a story of a romantic hero, but a longing for an image of America that never really existed, a dream of this country having some kind of glorious past while still acknowledging the horrible atrocities that shaped this nation. And, arguably, it is because of this that the Western endures as the genre most symbolic of the United States. A study of the Western is the study of film history itself, from the birth of cinema to the rise of Hollywood, to its fall in the 1960s and its reinvention in the new millennium. And so, despite being bruised and battered, reshaped and twisted, and even maimed, the Western film lives on, walking off into the sunset to endure forever.